You ready, Suyapa? Yeah. Okay, so welcome everyone to, well, officially this is Chicano Studies 136, Latinx Social Movements. I'm the instructor in the course, but this is a very special event that brings together students from across the across different classes and our campuses. Just a shout out to our sponsors of this event. We have the generous support of, obviously, of IDCLS, the Intercollegiate Department of Chicano Latino Studies, as well as the support of the WIG grant at Pomona College, which helps support bring in guests of this import. I wanted to just take a minute before we start with the program to introduce our guest today. I think saying that we are excited is an understatement. This is a real treat to introduce a person that I've long admired, and to have him here to share his work is really just a wonderful opportunity. Roberto Lovato is an educator, journalist, and writer based at the Writers Grotto. He's a recipient of a reporting grant from the Pulitzer Center. He's reported on the drug war, violence, terrorism in Mexico, Venezuela, El Salvador, Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, France, and the United States. He's held fellowships at UC Berkeley's Latinx Research Center, which is where I think I had the opportunity to meet him for the first time. And he has taught at UCLA and was also the co-founder of the first Central American Studies program in the country at Cal State Northridge. His essays and reports from around the world have appeared in numerous publications, including Guernica Magazine, the Boston Globe, Foreign Policy Magazine, The Guardian, the Los Angeles Times, Der Spiegel, La Opinión, and several other national and international publications. He's also a longtime activist and movement strategist, participating in campaigns to defeat Prop 187 in California, to drop the I word campaign. He was the co-founder of Presente.org, the country's largest online Latinx organization, best known for its successful campaign to remove Trump advisor Lou Dobbs from CNN. Most recently, Roberto has joined authors Miriam Gurba and David Balls in co-founding #Dignidad Literaria, which aims at advocating for equity and inclusion and literary justice for Latinx writers and authors that are often left off the bookshelves of the US and out of the national dialogue. Today, he is here to talk to us about his memoir, which many of our students got a chance to read, Unforgetting, a memoir of family, migration, gangs, and revolution in the Americas, a book that has garnered national attention and praise from luminaries and critics alike. So please help me in welcoming, even if it's through our emoji, Roberto Lovato. Welcome, Roberto.
Thank you, Arely, Suyapa, Hilda, the students and community. So happy to be here. I'm sad I can only be here with you in 2 dimensions, but I look forward to the time when we can be together in 3 dimensions. But in the meantime, we'll try to mimic 3-dimensionality with heart. You're muted, Arely.
So Roberto, to get us started, our students engaged the work and submitted questions that some of which you've already seen. But before we get into that, would you like to share a little bit about, or an excerpt from the book, or however you like to kind of talk about your work before we get started?
Yeah, I think what I'll do is read a small excerpt, and then we can start, the conversation. I think it's good for people who haven't read it to get a feel for the words, because books have a lot to do with the words. So the setting for this, my book is about my journey across 2,500 miles and 30 years of war, genocide, mass migration, narco violence, and the growth and the power of a community that survived all of that, because it's a positive story. And so it's at one level, that's what it's about. It's another level, it's about what makes Central America so violent, and what did the US have to do with it, and what are the secrets under that? But it's also my personal story, the way I tell it. And so it's my journey to find out about my father's secrets and my father's sometimes violent behavior, that it's often difficult for many of us to talk about our parents and their limits. And so I thought it was important to share that story. And so the scene right now is when my father, who was involved in the underworld of contraband and running guns to El Salvador and doing other things, pulls out one of those guns on me. And after that, actually, no, this is when my dad beat me up. And I am feeling humiliated and hurt. And my cousin's with me, my cousin Adilio, and he wants to lift my spirits. So he takes me to the backyard. He takes out this plastic bag from under an almond tree. He digs it up in secret. And this is where the scene begins. My cousin Adilio, and his mom's name is Tia Esperanza. So quick, let's go to my room, he said quietly as we rushed farther back in the yard, where Tia Esperanza had built several small concrete block apartments, the units her son and their families lived in. Adilio was 19 and didn't have his own family like his two older brothers, Memo and Oscar, but he did have a little room out back. We sat on his bed one by one. He took each item out of the bag with great care, like he was some priest at St. Anthony's taking the Eucharist from the communion cup in one of those ceremonies I could only play spectator in, as the only member of my Catholic family who never had a first Holy Communion. First came papers, stuff with scribbling on it, then a pamphlet, then black Maxell tapes that looked like the contraband ones Pop brought to El Salvador to sell or give as presents. Adilio, my cousin, displayed all the contents of the shopping bag on his bed, which was covered with one of those colorful woven indigenous blankets my mom brought to cover our beds back home in San Francisco. His pride hovered over the things on the bed and filled the entire room. Check this out, he said while holding a white pamphlet. Its pages were soiled from heavy use. The pamphlet had about 16 or so pages. The front side had a curious logo, 2 machine guns pointing in opposite directions. In between the machine guns were the words Fuerzas Populares de Liberación, Farabundo Martí, and even bigger letters spelling FPL, FPL, the name of the pamphlet, El Rebelde. Farabundo Martí, who's that? I asked him in a louder tone than his. Shh, he said, somebody's gonna hear us, idiota. Okay. Farabundo Martí was a great revolutionary who fought in El Salvador, in El General in the 30s or something, he said. He seemed to assume that I knew about this El General guy. Farabundo inspired the compas of today. Compas, I asked. That means compañeros, one of the names of los muchachos, the revolucionarios, call themselves. That's what Rolando, Cesar, and Lorena and other friends call their classmates. Yes, Adilio said, his impatience clear. Joking, Adilio, the guy who made fun of my Spanish, brilló por su ausencia, conspicuous by his absence. That word has many meanings, including classmate, friend, lover, and revolucionario. Cool. Okay, now shut up and listen to this. Read El Rebelde with your compañeros of the greatest confidence, making sure to take all the security measures. Remember, el enemigo is cruel, criminal, and merciless, and the rules of secretive work are a valuable way to combat them, to hit them without his knowing where the hits are coming from. Hit el enemigo without knowing him. That sounded like I should have dealt with Don Eve and maybe Pop, my father. Wow, I exclaimed, curious and slightly scared. What's this about? My friend at the university gave them to me, but you can't tell anybody, understand? Adilio said, sounding unusually manly and self-important. I sat quietly, my 13-year-old eyes taking in this secretive, almost religious air that filled his little box of a room. Understand? Okay, I won't. Doesn't the government have all those military guys and guns and planes and everything? Yes, they do have all that, Adilio said, but the guerrilleros have the spirit to fight and the heart of the people. Are you one of the muchachos, a guerrillero? No, but some of my friends are. I just helped them with past information. Wow, I thought. This serious stuff from my cousin, normally the funniest guy on the block. But Adilio's political secrets made sense coming from the son of Tia Esperanza, the woman who used to make us laugh while puckering up her lips and marching like President Molina, the military guy she called a fascista. What about all those military people who live around here? Won't they arrest or hurt you if they find out you have this? Yes, they'd hang me by the balls and take me out, make me eat them before killing me. And now you know. So you better keep quiet or they're going to get your little huevitos and make you eat them. I won't say anything, I promise. The recently shattered illusion of having a normal family making a familial promise feel weird. But I made it knowing I would in fact keep it. I desperately needed to build trust with someone while I was in this foreign place I hated at this moment, El Salvador. What's on the tape? Música de protesta, nueva canción, revolutionary music, music by people you've never heard of, Mercedes Sosa, Silvio Rodriguez, Kutumay Camones, and Yolo Cambaita. Here, check it out. Adito took out one of those black Maxell tapes labeled Música de Protesta and started playing it. The first song was called Poema de Amor, a simple song featuring a guitar, an indigenous drum, and a funny valeverguista voice singing verses based on a poem by some guy who used to live near Tia Esperanza's house named Roque Dalton. Listening to this song makes you a real Salvadoreño, he told me, looking straight at me as if somehow knowing how desperate my fragmented 13-year-old heart wanted to be part of something whole. The poem song about the different qualities, some quite tongue-in-cheek, that made one Salvadoran, working hard, migrating, going to prison, building the Panama Canal, drinking, whoring, smoking pot, sounded like Dalton's love poem for his people. Well, what do you think? Most of the words were outside the scope of my limited Spanish. The fear of all the neighbors who were also military men didn't help hide it. But Alidio's powerful, strange pride, his mix of rage and reverie in sharing it for a brief moment, transformed my own rage into a meditation on what it might mean for me, a curly-haired Mr. Peabody gringo, to call himself Salvadoreño. Thank you. So that's just a little bit of the chapters that deal with my upbringing. I divide the book in 3 sections: the present, 2015, and then the middle, which is from 1970s to around 2000, when I discovered this astonishing secret my dad has that I don't want to reveal because I want people to read the book and have the experience that I had, at least something approximating it. And then the last section of chapters is early 1930s El Salvador, when one of the most violent episodes, not just in Latin American history, but in world history happened. La Matanza of 1932 in El Salvador. And it's the most violent in terms of the number of people killed per day, per week in a concentrated space, according to scholars of violence at Oxford, like Anders Sandberg, who I interviewed in writing this book. And so I divided up the 3 sections, and I go back and forth across time and space like a chapulin, like a grasshopper, because I wanted to show the nature of memory, right? When you write a memoir, you're making a comment on how you see memory. And so memory is not linear. You don't just think in the present and you're looking forward. You go back. I say a word, I say pupusa, and you think about your abuelita. I say pendejo, and you think about somebody you grew up with or whatever, right? You go back and forth in time in your memory. So I wanted to reflect that, in addition to reflecting the fragmented nature of memory that's brought on by trauma, which I don't talk about as a word in the book, but people who've commented on it have said it's about trauma. So I'll leave it there for now and leave it now to you, Riley.
I love that you chose that passage to read. there's so much in there, but I think it really um, reflects on part of the book where, or part of the story arc of the book was you coming to redefine or a journey of identity, right? Of and you, in that passage that you read, you said, I hated being here. I hated this place. So I assume, Roberto, that you would travel to El Salvador with your family would take you. Was that, did you was that prior to the war really, starting? And then
Yes,
during yeah.
I grew up, I'm here in San Francisco and just about 3 blocks from Folsom Street, where I grew up, down the street from from the projects. I grew up very working class, very poor, crowded immigrant household. Me and my brother were the only ones born in the US of the Salvadoran family. And I had love from my parents, but also had these two gifts. My dad was a janitor for United Airlines and my mom was a maid with Hyatt Regency. So I got discounted hotel and free airline tickets, and I flew like a prince around the world, mostly to El Salvador, but to other places as well. And so I had what Shakespeare called rich eyes and poor hands, because I'd always come back right down the street from the projects. And so I got to see El Salvador before the war. So the scene I painted was before the war.
Yeah, that's fascinating. But I think what the passage that you read makes me think of one of the themes that we're exploring in social movement, in the social movements class. We read your book after reading the case study of Chicanx activism in the U.S. Southwest, and then reading about Puerto Rican migration and activism, and then we moved into what was the transnational activism of Salvadoreños and other Central Americans. And it's interesting to me that in your passage you reflect on these moments that to me are so Salvadoran. I remember visiting El Salvador too, and being sort of exposed, right? Like being invited to like a Roque Dalton reading. And this was after the war, but it was still kind of clandestine, right? There was still some level of nervousness about, hey, we're gonna take you here, but let's not talk too much about where we're going. And being introduced to the song, the canciones de protesta, and these moments that kind of give you a sense of an alternative way to understand what the meaning of being Salvadoran is, right? Of being rooted to this kind of, and rooted in a political struggle that is very rich. And it sounds to that passage that you read were those little inklings of you starting to find out that the treasure and the value of that, right? In the songs, in the FPL, posters. And it obviously, as you read later on in the book, it definitely had a profound impact on your life as you chose to join the revolutionary struggle later on in your life.
Absolutely. Yeah, I did this intentionally. I wanted to share, by the way, the things that I'm telling in this book about, for example, the story of, there's always different ways to read a book, different ways to interpret, different ways to interpret them, different arcs, right? The way the story travels. So one arc of my book is the story of me coming to awareness in my identity as a Salvadoreño, but also as a person born in the United States. How I go from being a kid who loved G.I. Joe, Captain America, Marvel Comics, before there was any Marvel movies, by the way, there were Marvel Comics, for those of you that don't know. I cried at baseball games where they would play the national anthem when Willie Mays and Willie McCovey were defeating the Los Angeles Dodgers. Sorry, gente, but that's how we roll here. And I defended America before those radical Salvadoran friends of my cousin who I would beat at chess. They were older than me, but I was a little geek, Mr. Peabody chess champion, until I rebelled against all of that. And, I tossed it all in the trash, and along with my grades of high school were worthless, for example. So when I you know, I went from being that kid to being a person who no longer calls themselves American. I don't use the word as a journalist or as an individual without quotes. The only way I'll use it without quotes if I put an accent on the E, because I consider myself a person that is of the United States of America with an accent on the E. And when I put that E on the American, I become a different person and the border is instantly erased in my mind. So like any political change requires an act of imagination before anything, which is why I dedicated almost 5 years of my life to write this, because it's the story of how I came to being this good American to being a revolutionary. I've never talked about this because I've been in the closet about being revolutionary for 25 years almost before writing this book. And it was a big, important decision for me. There's so many compañeros, I bet you students of yours, people listening now have family who are in the FMLN. Some were in, I remember from teaching at Northridge, some students have family who were fascists, military people who murdered others. I found that in the classroom as well. And I find, you know, people that have these fascist inclinations now with evangelical churches, I'm sorry to offend anybody, but right now they're using those churches to mobilize people for fascist ideology around Trump.
Yeah, yeah. I very much appreciate, and I want to promise the audience that we will open it up for Q&As, but I wanted to ask you about that, you know, these histories, obviously this is such a gift for the community and for our historical memory, what you've given us, but you have taken risks, right? I don't know if anybody has written about you know, the connections between the transnational connections between the nonprofit world today and its revolutionary origins. I don't think that that's been really documented, and I guess it goes to the heart of, and like you said, that there was risks involved in talking about people's involvement in revolutionary struggle. And I've been witness to people finding each other and going, oh, and you know, you have a kind of lingo that, like you said, the compa thing. I love that line, which is compa can mean so many different things in different contexts. But if you were part of the revolutionary left, you had an understanding that when someone called you compa, it was an honor, right? They were respecting you as someone in the struggle. But I guess the main question that I wanted to ask you that I think is important for our class and our students of social movements is, you have really seen the trajectory of, you know, the activism that we sort of glorify, right? The sanctuary movement, the solidarity movement of the 80s, the immigrant rights struggle in the 90s. You were
the armed struggle in the 80s and too.
Right, exactly, right. And so I wonder what your perspective is on, and if you want to speak to, or if you could speak to, what are some lessons, because I know that activists like you have roots in that revolutionary struggle, but your stories are so not well known, right? How Central Americans contribute to, you know, in terms of innovative strategies and ways of thinking and whatnot, that haven't really been documented. So obviously your story is an important one, but I wanted to see if you could speak to our students about what were some of those contributions in the way that, you know, immigrant rights struggles in particular and other forms of social movements have really borrowed from and have built on the ways that Central Americans organized, you know, in the 80s and early 90s. What are the continuities? And you could also speak to what are some of the limitations, right? In terms of how those continuities didn't really, haven't pound out maybe in the ways that we would have expected.
That's a great question. One, unfortunately, that I'm unable to answer without a PhD thesis to write. But
it's an intense question, yeah.
What I can say is that, yes, Salvadoreños and Centroamericanos have contributed mightily to many social movements in the United States. You've never had the story of a refugee community that has challenged the foreign war policy and domestic immigration policy of the most powerful country on earth in successful ways like we did, like Salvadoreños did. That's never, I don't think in US history you have any other example of that kind of like, I don't use the word transnational because it was, I don't know, we were just doing it. People then came and told us, hey, that's amazing transnational work you're doing. We were just doing what was natural. And so, yeah, the Salvadoran experience was rich. That's part of what I'm trying to rescue, because if you look at the image of the FMLN in government, that's another image. That's not my FMLN. And there's a chapter in the book where I go to mass grave sites where the FMLN Attorney General and the FMLN police actually pull guns on me to force me to erase pictures of mass graves. So that's not my FMLN. I bring, and I unforget the FMLN of the more, I would say, heroic era of the FMLN, when we were fighting literally a fascist military dictatorship that massacred 75 to 80,000 people. And the response of the people was that one of every 3 Salvadoreños was organized against the state. Highly political community. So when people migrated, they entered labor unions. And you look at the labor movement, and even today, some of those people are now higher ups in the US labor movement. You look at the church, you look at this thing called Sanctuary now, which is an anemic copy of the Sanctuary that started with the Salvadoreños in the 1980s, primarily LA and San Francisco, and then the rest of the country, establishing these laws that separated police from the immigration services. Lo and behold, that day is gone now, right? Obama destroyed it with 287G and secure communities. And so the fight on immigrant rights at its core has many Salvadoreña leaders and strategies, including like transnational strategies, to use that word, like what Alianza Americas, led by my friend Oscar Chacon. You know, we called him El Grillo, him and his brother, because those guys would jump across the United States, organizing people in all these different cities, like they were grasshoppers, right? They're just so listos. And Guillermo, his brother, was like un grillo super chistoso, a really funny guy who organized with humor. So I think that's an important lesson too, how you organize. Había algo que le llamábamos mística revolucionaria, revolutionary mystique, how you deal with people, how you speak in public. The dirigente is not supposed to swear. You know, there's even booklets that they would give out on how to be a good dirigente and organizer. And there's something to be learned in that. We need to educate ourselves about not just overall big analysis, but how we treat people and how we act and struggle and how we're examples. I curse a little bit because I'm kind of getting old. And, but so yeah, you see the Salvadoreño movement, it was one of the like top 3 social movements in the 1980s, along with the nuclear freeze and environmental movements. Hundreds of thousands of Norte Americanos were organized through organizations like the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, CISPES. Now, the story of CISPES and the story of Sanctuary were written as if it was white people that had organized them. It's only until now that we're getting, and this is again why I decided to write my book, because I want others to write their stories. This isn't the only story by far. There's thousands and thousands of stories to be told about our communities and Centroamericanos in general. And so the story as told of Sanctuary was that, you know, some white person was inspired by their interpretation of the gospel to support the poor little refugees, and the poor little refugee is just this 2-dimensional image that has no agency, no action, when in fact, that poor little refugee was a former revolutionary who was organizing the white person, right? And so we need to reclaim that so the young people have a sense of their deep-rooted power. But we live in a country that, in the case of indigenous people, erased their memories by educating them in Indian schools that cut off African slaves from their warrior traditions, right? From their culture and from their language. And so what you say, Adeli, is extremely true, is that I wrote this as an act of memoria histórica, which is an approach in America Latina and in Spain where memory is not just used to remember things, but it's an act, it's used as in the pursuit of justice.
Beautiful. You know, what it makes me think about, and by the way, I would like to invite folks that if you have a question that you want to submit, you can do so in the chat function. Is Suyapa still with us? I don't know if I don't
I'm
see.
here. I'm catching you.
Do you think that we should take questions in the chat function, or is there an alternative way that we could do that?
Would be best.
That would be best, right? Okay, so if you'd like to submit questions, I think one of the last things that I want to comment on, Roberto, is that you know, like with every movement, it reminds me of your piece, your point about the FMLN and how the FMLN is now the state, you know, and so
Not anymore. They
without,
were.
or they were, yeah, that's right. With every social movement, there's a form of the kind of institutionalization process that happens, right? Like the movement becomes an organization that then becomes, you know, tied to certain funding, you know, interests and needs. How do you see that the social movements and the solidarity movement in the 80s? Is there still that spirit, that sort of spirit of wanting to organize in the legacy of those movements, i.e. you worked with Carecen, obviously, are there organizations, or maybe not nonprofits, but other groups that you still see that kind of spirit of contesting rather than just managing, right? Quote unquote, sort of immigrants' rights. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, let's look at immigrant rights. I've written a lot about immigrant rights. I was involved all the way back to 1987, even before 1994. But in 1994, California governor who wanted to be president, Pete Wilson, launched Proposition 187 here, which is fundamental to the national anti-immigrant racist politic. It's the beginning of the new politics of race that lead to Trump on immigration and to Obama. Because remember, the caging, separation, and mass separation and mass caging began with Obama and his Homeland Security chief, Jay Johnson. And so we were fighting Pete Wilson in the early 90s, and Carecen, Chirla, and other organizations played a fundamental role. We were doing things with these nonprofit structures because they're very limiting and suffocating, not just because of the funding, but because of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, when it doesn't like what you're doing, will literally do like Cecilia Munoz, who was in the White House when I was at Presente.org. She would call people at foundations that gave Presente money and basically say, look, they're not really friendly to us. And so our funding would get cut, because if you're going to be effective in politics, and you're going to excuse me, Arely, if I pull out of dirigente character and into Roberto, who grew up near the projects character for a moment. Como decimos en buen salvadoreño, if you're going to be effective in politics, le tenés que tocar los huevos al tigre. You have to touch the balls of the tiger. Otherwise, what's the point? To make the tiger comfortable? That's what I think the Democratic Party has reduced our politics to too often. We saw sparks of something different with the Bernie Sanders campaign, but don't be fooled, because now you're going to have these appeals not just to be, say, like a white man like Joe Biden, but you're going to have what I call the intersectional empire now, where Black and brown people are going to be dancing and singing and chanting like Martin Luther King or something, but telling you to support bombing, caging, staging coups in Honduras, destroying immigrant life, just like Trump. So be mindful, young people, of what's coming, because it's going to look more like you and smell and sound like you, but it's not going to be you in your heart. So yeah, I think that there are elements of emancipatory politics outside of, and I think you look at the divisions in the immigrant rights movement, and it's rich. you have groups like back in the day when the Dreamers, for example, were divided. When they were becoming too effective, the Democratic Party deployed all its operatives, its foundations. They funded and created these basically center-right neoliberal dreamer groups. And then you had the dreamers who were really bold and intrepid and willing to tocarle al tigre where the tigre needed to be touched. And they challenged Obama and forced his hand along with Presente.org and others of us. And so, you know, there's a, yeah, there's a lot to be learned. And I think one of the best learnings though is make sure you keep it personal and in your heart and in your values. Nobody's gonna pay you to dream. I can tell you that from my experience. Revolutionary activity, nobody paid me for it. I volunteered, I gave, and I sacrificed. Many people I knew sacrificed their entire life. They were killed for this higher ideal. Nobody's gonna pay you to. So if you think that you're gonna go to college and then go and get a dreamy job to do revolution, that's not quite the way to dream, I think. I think you need to have economic stability and the dream side by side. And maybe one day somebody pays you to write a book with the revolution on it. But it took me 56 years just to give you an idea of the environment we're in. So that, you know, the dream has to be separate from the funding. You can't have these community leaders making $250,000 a year to be leaders of communities where they don't even live in nonprofits. They live away from them, but they come back to work in these poor communities, and then they're speaking for the community for $250,000, $300,000 a year. You can't really profit from the dream because then it doesn't become the dream anymore.
Thank you. We have a wonderful question submitted here by Professor Hernandez Medina. We can go ahead and I can ask Esther to share the question if you'd like.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for talking about your experiences. I was saying in the chat that I'm from the Dominican Republic, and my dad was in the Dominican Communist Party, so I felt identified with many of the things you said. Like I grew up listening to Nueva Trova, to protest music, you know, having Monsignor Romero being like one of the figures that we always talked about. And of course, all the connections between different revolutionary movements in the region. So my question to you is, in your experience, and I mean, I haven't read the book, so I don't know if you address it there, but what did you see in terms of the connections between Salvadorian revolutionaries and revolutionaries in other countries? Because what I remember growing up is there were always connections, you know, like people from different countries always looking at each other and learning from each other. You know, people going to Nicaragua for the revolution, to El Salvador, and so on.
Oh, absolutely. That would be a book in and of itself to see the, because, you know, like, you know, I remember when I was at Berkeley, starting to get aware and conscious, like many of the students are, about these different movements and how they work. And I, you know, I studied with people like the poet June Jordan, who shared a lot of poetry from different parts of the world. And, you know, my mind started like buzzing. And then I eventually joined the Frente. And when I was there, I would, you know, going back, when I learned about June Jordan and what she was telling us, like the Spanish Civil War was like that was the movement of the moment. And Hemingway, people that you read about in your English classes, but they don't often tell you, Hemingway went to fight fascists during the Spanish Civil War. George Orwell, who wrote 1984, went to Spain, and he was so inspired. He wrote what in the English language is one of the most beautiful tomes about the Spanish Civil War in English, the Homage to Catalunya, the beginning of that. And you see the glory of socialist revolutionary organizing, like few passages in the English language in the 20th century. I encourage you to study and read it. So in the same token, when you had El Salvador, it was one of the major movement of its time. The FMLN was considered one of the most effective political military people's movements of the 20th century in America Latina, because we were trained by the Vietnamese. I wasn't, but my friends were. They were trained by these 5-foot generals who defeated not just the United States, the most powerful military, they defeated the French, they defeated other colonial powers. And so my friends in the FMLN were taught by the best. That's why the CIA respected them. And so when you go to the Chalatenango in the mountains, in the guerrilla camps, you would meet Paula, a German doctor that I knew. And she spoke Spanish with this very German accent, very funny. I wish I could write about her. Or Nathan, a Brazilian dentist, you know, who would take all these risks. You had white people, Norteamericanas, who were in solidarity with El Salvador, some of whom joined the Frente. You had Spaniards, you had Mexicans. My friend here, Gato, I'll just leave his name at that because he may not want to be out about that, but Gato was un compañero guerrillero. And so it was, and me, I was not born, I tell people, look, I wasn't some tropical dude from down south. I grew up on Folsom Street, on just 3 blocks from working class kid who used to do low riding, who used to dress up in Pendletons and wino shoes, who used to rob people, who used to be kind of violent and steal cars and things. And then I kind of took another path with my rage, and I focused the rage in an internationalist way. So my own story is an international story, porque mis papás son de El Salvador, pero yo soy gringo indio, as my compañeros would call me. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you so much.
One other thing I would add.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I can say it, why not, shit. I was offered, I didn't do it for different reasons at the time because I was busy with some other things, but there was also a global movement of revolutionaries. Like, I was asked if I wanted to consider learning how to intervene in banking systems to get money for the revolution by people in the Middle East. And so you had Vietnamese trainers, you know, Lebanese revolutionaries, the PLO. It was internationalist, but so was the fascist right? The fascist right that is supported, in the case of, say, Venezuela, for example, right now, you have the Democrats with their think tanks and the Republicans and their think tanks doing open funding of right-wing fascist groups in Venezuela, some of whom tried to kill me when I was in Venezuela, but that's a whole nother book.
Roberto, you have a lot of books in your future, I think. So I have a few students who submitted questions to me privately, and I think I sent this to you, but they're messaging me again that they were very inspired by your the love story in the book. And I think that was for those of you who haven't read the book, I mean, it is a love story, right? A love story about your family, and obviously the protagonist or the main character, G. And the students wanted to know what was your decision making about how to end that story arc. So we know that G played a role in your life in terms of your revolutionary commitment. And then I think that the students want to know the part 2 of G. How did you decide how to wrap that story up? How much to say about her story? And now we want G to write a story. We want to hear her perspective about that relationship.
Believe me, I've spent years trying to get G and other friends, like the friends who were trained by the Vietnamese, great revolutionaries that I've known, to tell their stories. You can look in my acknowledgments in the book, and there's more than a handful of great revolutionaries in the pages of the acknowledgement. I just don't label them, you know, but I want people, and you know, I want people to say, puta, Lovato no hizo ni mierda. Yo vi más guerra que ese cabrón. So go write your book, bro. That's why I wrote it, right? Like, you know, but in terms of G, just for context, G was a woman. Now I was starting to get kind of crazy and radical here in San Francisco, and I met her here. She was a diplomat with the Frente, one of the only people who could be publicly FMLN. And we fell in love, but I was already on my way thinking of going to El Salvador, and I was also excuse my language, I'm sure many of you are not this, but I was a 25-year-old dumbass in the matters of love. Okay, and so, you know, I left El Salvador knowing that war and sex go well together, let us say. And so, and I won't tell you what happens because then it would give away a kind of a beautiful love story I think I put in there, right? One of the great romances of my life. So what happened afterwards, you know, G basically got me to come back to the States. And we moved to LA. And like anybody who was in solidarity here in San Francisco and LA knows who G is. I asked her if she wanted me to use her name. She said no. Like many Salvadoreños, they're residents or trying to become citizens, and there's this layers of trauma and state surveillance. Like the FBI, as you'll see in my book, had tried to infiltrate us during the war. They failed, and we defeated their plans to infiltrate us. But you know, they were there always. And so, so G and I came back and lived happily for like several years together. And eventually we parted ways because of differences in terms of our direction in life. Like I was born here. It was easy for me to separate from the Frente and from the movement. I'm like, all right, dude, I did my part. Now I'm gonna go do other stuff that I've been wanting to do. G was born in Chalatenango, lost many members of her family, had very strong family issues, and you know, kind of found a new family in the Frente. And it was much more difficult for her to separate from the revolutionary movement than it was for me. I think that was a part of it, along with other things. But we were together for many years happily, and we're still friends. She was at my mom's bedside when, and that's what I'm trying to show with the love story is that, I mean, the love story is actually is one of the main ways I show what a revolutionary is in many ways, because Che Guevara was not joking when he says that the revolutionary is motivated by profound feelings of love for humanity or something to that effect. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to show that, you know, we didn't ever have a choice as Salvadoreños to have our love and our tenderness be right next to the horror and the terror of US fascist military dictatorships and their violence. And so we never had a choice. So the story, the way it's usually told by a white person, there's just all this really terror and bad stuff that leads somebody like Joan Didion to say in these big words like terror is the given of the place. And I used to believe it when I was a student's age because, you know, like, oh, wow, that sounds deep. El Salvador's finally in the English language. Later on, I realized, oh, hell, man, that's like BS. Because she said that after 2 weeks, mostly at the embassy. And after 56 years, I'm like, actually, no. Love is also the given of the place and of the people. And that's kind of one of the points of my book.
Beautiful. Thank you for that, Roberto. And yes, the students are submitting messages privately. Thank you for asking the question about G. We have a question submitted from the distinguished Roland Valencia, who joins us. Roland, would you like me to read the question, or would you like to?
Yeah, I can. Hey, Roberto, ¿cómo estás? Wow, so great to see you. You know, I'm just so excited you're doing this, that you wrote the book, and that you are, you know, reclaiming disability and memories. And so, you know, first of all, I want to thank you for your contributions to your academia. You gave me a chance to be a guest lecturer at Cal State Northridge. Forever grateful. It really, you know, just spoke to my passion. So my question to you is, you know, there are many more Central Americans, especially Salvadorians, in academia now. And many of our issues, immigration and, you know, just the whole range, you know, has been incorporated into political platforms, you know, in one of the two major parties, meaning Democratic Party. And, you know, and on the surface, it looks great. You know, obviously, when you have to choose between the super reactionary party, and one that at least makes an attempt to address your issues. How does academia, and especially Central American academics, how do they? What is their role in terms of providing clarity, to especially young people, and certainly for the rest of us, how do we navigate that so we're not 4 years from now assuming that Biden wins and and there's a democratic blue wave, so to speak, and we wake up and we're like, what happened? I mean, our issues were not fundamentally addressed. So how do we, what's the role of academia in helping us to untangle that and to provide some clarity?
No, ante todo, it's lovely to see you, Roland, my old friend from many years. Wow. Hey, you look great. You look the same.
I feel like a 60-year-old, long hair and nowhere to go.
Bien hippie, peludo, man, qué bonito. So, meanwhile, I used to have curly hair. I used to have a fro, by the way. You'll see it in the book.
I remember those pictures.
On the cover in the book, like.
There you go.
Wow.
Yeah, that's pissed off me with my parents graduating from junior high school. So.
Wait, I have a picture. Are you showing the picture?
I was. So that's another one of those, golden questions that can't be answered without a PhD thesis, Roland. So thank you for missing my gig up here, dude. So, but right anyway. What's the role? I mean, I think it's the role of the intellectual in society, right? We live in a society that doesn't respect or validate intellectuality generally, beginning with the salaries of teachers.
Yeah.
Say no more. But in addition to that, we live in an anti-intellectual country that separates, for example, poetry from politics, intellectuality from politics. Public intellectuality as measured in magazines, liberal publications, doesn't include a left flank by and large. Just look, for example, at all these Pulitzer Prize winners, National Book Award winners. The vast majority of them didn't say a single word of criticism about Barack Obama when he was bombing people, when he staged a coup in Honduras, when he caged children, when he separated them, when he pushed thousands, almost 3,000 mothers, children, and fathers to their deaths in the deserts of Sonora and Texas and Arizona. I've been there. I've been to the mass grave sites where these justices of the peace just take the body parts and the bones and the remains. They put it in plastic bags or milk cartons, and they put it in a mass grave site at Brooks County. That wasn't Trump. That was under Obama. And so I say this because I think intellectuals, academics, first and foremost, we have a responsibility to the truth as much as we can, say that we have some truth or a version of our version of the truth. We have to be intellectually honest. Hay que ser honestos intelectualmente. You can't just, like when I was one of the first people on national television to critique Obama's immigration policy 5 months after he was elected. It was already clear he was going to start massively deporting and ripping up, destroying families. I went on Democracy Now! In July of 2009, and I kind of like said what I knew, documented along with Arti Shahani of Families for Freedom. So what happened, people told me, hey, you're offending the Black community. Hey, you're racist. Hey, I'm like, pero yo ya tengo años en esto, a mí me vale. A mí me vale if you're whatever your race. If you're performing fascist practices and you're Salvadoran, I have fought you. If you are doing caging children and you're Black, I have denounced you. I think we have to have that degree of intellectual honesty and not hide away right now, because that kind of silence for not just Centroamericanas, but for Latinx peoples as a whole right now has us in a situation where our COVID-19 deaths don't matter. Our young people being shot and killed aren't in the news. Our people getting like destroyed and caged does not make news until Donald Trump makes it news. This is very dangerous. So I think a ferocious, passionate commitment to the truth, whatever that may be for you, is the foundation, and then organizing ourselves intellectually to be able to make sure that our story's told. I think, yeah, storytelling at a time when silence is death, silence is destruction, storytelling is a political act. So I wrote my book as an act of memoria histórica, a political act conscious of what I'm trying to do, which is to model behavior for young people, for example. Tell your stories. I know you have them. You've been my students. I know your stories. I know that your families have struggled to be here, and that your stories are as valid as anything in the news that only puts out a black and white image of the United States, right? And so I encourage you young people to fight for your truth, because I can tell you from El Salvador, what El Salvador taught me is before you kill somebody, you have to take away their humanity. Before you pass awful policies, you have to take away people's humanity. You have to deny them the truth of their story. So see storytelling, see documentation, see research, see creating Central American studies, see all these different acts as political acts. I always have in whatever I've done.
Thank you. No, just a little side comment. It's so interesting that you mentioned the Spanish Civil War. And just by coincidence, literally on Sunday, I started to watch a 6-part documentary, which, and oh my God, I'm like, I can't believe this is so Central America. You know, like, you know, Spain in 1930s, it was so, I was blown away at just the similarities, but also the behavior of the Republicans, which ironically were the progressive wing of the movement. And I highly, highly, highly recommend, this Spanish Civil War documentary. It's a 6-part series. You will be glued to that, to your TV or computer. But I think it really provides a context, and it made me understand the Central American radical movements, so much better, and it gave an incredible context, because you can almost draw a straight line between that and what was happening in Central America in the 80s.
Roland, will you put it in the chat, because some students are asking?
Yeah.
Just to put in the chat. So we have about a little bit over 10 minutes left, before we let Roberto rest for a little bit, and then we have this is a 3-part conversation with Roberto.
What part if you include Cal State LA?
Oh, that's right, a 4-part. So Cal State LA is going to be hosting a talk later this evening, and it's going to be the same Zoom link. We're going to resume a conversation in Professor Portillo's class, and then again we're going to get together in Professor Ochoa's class throughout the day. And we were hoping to kind of structure the discussion around different themes. The next class is at 12:45 to 2:30 p.m. We actually have a really interesting question Roberto submitted from a graduate student in Chicago, and I think I'm going to sort of paraphrase it in the chat, but I think it speaks to this question of these counter narratives, right? And how we kind of reconstruct the history that's, outside of the ways in which dominant institutions have licensed that story. Josh Bergeron says that he is, putting together a dissertation on the solidarity movements, but a lot of the research that he has access to has been produced by the U.S. intelligence, right? And that he's wondering if you have any advice about, and he's very interested in kind of your forensic approach, but how to get at an alternative history, right? And I guess for you, it was through oral histories and through these other kind of, kind of alternative methods. How do you kind of weave or use that kind of official story, and then sort of contest that or provide an alternative history? I'm sort of paraphrasing, but
Okay.
I'll leave it in the chat.
Well, that's another one of those, $50 million dissertations I can't write yet. But I think that we have to be aware of the narratives of the state because they prevail. And that's where you get the idea of a counter narrative. From the storyteller perspective, from the documentarian perspective, in me at least, I consciously try to avoid counter and just be the story. And it's weird because I have insecurities like all of us do, as students out there, you have insecurities, so do I. But I took the risks anyway. That's what fearlessness is feeling the fear and doing it anyway. So the fear to tell my own story, I haven't been out about being, for example, in the FMLN, like when I knew Roland back when I was at Caresen, that nobody knew, because I put that aside. People had Loelia because our whole environment was revolutionary, but I was never, you could never say I said that in public until now. And so my narrative was not a counter narrative. My narrative was my family story, but it was still worried and insecure about, oh, wow, what if somebody else tells this story before I do? What if a white person says it first? Like there were people writing about El Salvador, these books that are coming out. And if you look at all the books written recently about Salvadorans, they're all in English, at least. They're written by white people, mostly white women, some white men. And you have that fear and insecurity. You're like, oh God, they're going to be able to tell my story. But then in the process of writing, and this is why I encourage people to just write, I started realizing, damn, dude, how the hell are they going to match my story if it's my story? It's my family story. Baja, you're not going to be able to tell my family story any better than I can because it's my story. You all have that at your disposal. In your heart and in your voice, you have it right now to tell your own story. And you get more confident in it. I think that's the place to start from. And then it's not a counter narrative. It becomes your narrative. And then if it counters the state narrative, then great. But intellectually, oral history is the way to go for me. I put this together based on interviews as a journalist, going across all these years. Also in my own experience, the memoir form is very cool. I never thought I would write a memoir. I've always been a journalist. But then I realized, how the hell am I going to talk about my dad? Because I hadn't even decided to be out about my militancy, much less I wanted to tell another story. But then I had to tell a story of my dad, and I started revealing, and I learned how to tell family stories in a way I'd never learned before. And then I'm like, shit, I might as well be out about my other stuff as well. The whole enchilada, not the whole enchilada, but a big piece of the enchilada or the tamal, if you prefer, put it out there. And yeah, I think oral history and documentary research, I mean, the people are still there. The memory of, say, solidarity is still there. You have the Angela Zambranos of the world and CISPES out there in your part of the world in Pitzer. You have my friend Aquiles Magaña, who has also played a role in CISPES. You have all kinds of people. There are people you don't even know about who are out there because they haven't been out like me about their militancy. And so there's all these secrets. I would look at it as an opportunity to go out into the underworld, right? Because there's a whole underworld thread in my book. My book goes into the underworld, not just of the Frente, the underworld of solidarity, the underworld of my father's history and its subconscious, the underworld of my own secret past, the underworld of migration and immigrant prisons, and the underworld of nations, right? So you got to go underground to get at the gold that's in the dark, right?
That's right.
And buried. I think that's my best answer.
That's beautiful. So we're gonna, we only have 5 minutes left. So I don't know if anybody wants to submit any other questions. And if
I want
not,
to know why they don't ask publicly, and they have to go through teacher.
no, they're actually, most of them are asking publicly, and some I think wanted to be respectful, like the G question.
Okay, it's okay. It's okay. You can ask it. I don't have to answer it, but please ask it publicly. You know, have the, you know, put your conviction
Uh,
out there.
so, so I guess in closing, Roberto, we have here at the Claremont colleges, you know, students that are organizing some groups. The Central American Student Association is trying to start off again. You know, looking back to SEO's time, which organized across California and whatnot. What are some I guess imparting words of wisdom for young people that maybe want to organize in a Central American specific space? What are some thoughts? Yeah, about that for our students.
Well, I mean, it's kind of like Roland's question. You have to, first of all, have a politic that is rooted in something as true as you can make it. First of all, don't do it because it's cool or because it's trendy, or, you know, you can put together a pizza club if you want to do that. But, you know, I think that, and there's nothing apolitical or wrong with eating pizza. I love pizza. Look at my gut. But, you know, I think that, I mean, I'll speak to organizing generally right now. One of the reasons I wrote the book is I've been across 2,500 miles and 30 years of war, death squads, mass graves. I was pursued by death squads. I've lost friends. I've been to Guatemala, and I've been in Mexico. I've had narcos approach me with guns in hand. I've gone and I've seen all these mass grave sites from the entire 2,500 miles, you know, that La Bestia goes across. I've been to see children and mothers in prison. I've seen the freezers in Pima County, Arizona, where the smell of 100 decomposing bodies of children and mothers and parents are there. And I'm like, damn, dude, why don't I have a fucking bullet in my head? Right? That's the question. So the reason is, in the process of writing my book, I figured out that what got me through was the sublime and the beautiful. That's, if you look at the book, I tried my best to make it beautiful. I don't know if I succeed, but I tried the best that I could, because that's what got me to carry through Dante, my own private version of Dante's 9 circles of hell. And so having seen this, I'm like, wow, I have something to share with not just Centroamericanos, but with humanity right now. Because we're facing, let's say we defeat Donald Trump in November, y Padre, Hijo, Espíritu Santo, todos contra Trump, a derrotar ese hijo de puta, all right? Sorry, but professors, but that's how I feel. If we defeat Trump, you're still going to have a fascist base that's there. You're still going to have COVID-19. You're still going to have a declining US economy. Not insurmountable, but there are great challenges. And so I knew this was going to be something like what the world was going to be like when I wrote this book. And I shared the story of my journey into Dante's 9 circles of hell, my version, because I wanted to share a story that had hope and beauty and power, like the one that helped me not have a bullet in my head. And so whatever in you makes you feel like that, you better pull it out right now, because your world is going to start looking like El Salvador in its worst times, unfortunately. But it's also going to look at like it in the best of times. You're going to find power in yourself like I did, that I never knew I had as a poor kid that grew up in the mission. I mean, people say, damn, Lovato, you're fucking crazy. You're a badass. I don't know what I am, but I know that I was insecure. I grew up poor.
Thank you, Roberto.
Eso es lo mejorcito que tengo. Se los doy de corazón.
Yeah, thank you. And there's all kinds of wonderful messages in the chat for sharing your wisdom and your humanity with all of us. Obviously, I encourage all of you to stay with us, to come back at 12:45, to submit to Roberto, you know, any kind of messages and follow-ups if you want. But thank you so much, Roberto. We will see you in half an hour.
I'm gonna come back because you guys have tired me out. You've been so good. So sorry, I'm gonna just check out of the rest of this thing for the rest of the day.
You can check out. We can have Roland sub in for you. Be like,
yeah,
hi, I'm Roberto.
Roland, please take over.
Gracias, Roland. Gracias, everyone. We'll see you in a little bit. Thank you, Roberto. Thank you, everyone.
My pleasure.